I think a lot of people, and I take your point about Benjamin Netanyahu, but I think that he has been an incredibly staunch, strong-willed leader who has kept focused on the hostages. And even earlier, when the ceasefire was delayed, was because he had insisted that Hamas release the names of the hostages, and a weaker leader might not have done that. Do you not think that in your view...
Look, he's been, whether you love or hate the guy, he's a strong leader. But just strength in politics doesn't mean that you're making the right decisions.
But on this case, do you think that in particular, with the situation with the hostages, the fact that he's hung firm, and even after the release of the hostages, they have actually said that we want to eradicate Hamas?
Yeah, he's done what he said he was going to do, but at what cost to the Palestinian people? You know, we can only take the figures that are released by Hamas or a branch of Hamas. Now, Hamas are a proscribed terror organisation. We get all of that. So they tell us how many people, how many kids are being killed, how many men and women are being killed. So at what cost has he achieved this success? And that's going to, again, in the coming days and weeks, that's going to make itself known to us. So there has been a disproportionate amount of Palestinians who have been killed by this. He said, release the hostages, we don't need to have an incursion. They didn't release the hostages, the military incursion, and of course so many thousands of people have died. So at what cost? That is the cost.
Don't you think there's a lot of pressure being put on Benjamin Netanyahu's shoulders? And it seems to be deflected from Hamas, who, let's be honest, we had October the 7th, which was disgraceful. And even then, operatives were found to be part of UNRWA. They were arrested. And then even then, they were still saying, oh, well, we would, not the UNRWA, but the rest of the Hamas was saying that we would repeat this again. So you say at a cost, but I actually think that when you're dealing, I think what it is in the West is that we don't really have any understanding of what it's like to be dealing with people like this.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, a lot of people that haven't been in a war conflict, and we're very lucky in this country to have, you know, I know obviously, you know, a long time ago there was a world war, but in our lifetime, with everyone sitting on this panel, we're, you know, hopefully not going to experience that. So in that situation, it's very, as you say, Dan, it's very, you know, easy to blame fingers, but actually, let's be honest, people are dying. The ceasefire is the most important thing, but Benjamin is being investigated for war crimes. Let's not forget that, you know. He's not been, when we say strong leader, I mean, he's been killing hundreds of thousands of people.
Well, not him directly.
Well, you know, under his leadership, right?
This is a war, and let's not forget what Israel have dealt with. They have dealt with attacks from multiple angles. It hasn't just been Hamas, it's been Hezbollah. It's also been a major attack from Iran, which would have decimated Israel had it not been for the collaboration of the West. Let's be honest, they've been facing these attacks, which is why they have the Iron Dome, which is so effective, because they've been facing these attacks all the time as a defensive measure, so they don't need to attack. And Hamas have been firing those rockets well before October the 7th. But joining us now is Dan Pfefferman, who is an analyst in the Middle East, in Middle East affairs. Dan, really good to join you, to have you on board. Thank you for joining us. What are your thoughts of this particular deal and the ceasefire agreement?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I've been listening to the conversation, and if we could just stop with these hundreds of thousands of people killed statement, it's absolute nonsense. It's tens of thousands, and at least half of those, if not more, are verified combatants, terrorists, whatever, militants, whatever you want to call them. This is a very tough deal for the Israeli public to swallow. And there is something, you know, again, as I listen to your discussion in the studio in the UK, the West does not understand what it means to face such jihadist enemies. I have to say, Israel, prior to October 7th, didn't really understand what it means to face jihadist enemies. These are people who stoked a brutal invasion on October the 7th of Israel. Israel had left. The world seems to have forgotten. The Middle East seems to have forgotten. The hundreds of thousands of people who are marching in your streets in the UK, chanting for intifada and for revolution and for jihad, seem to have forgotten. Israel left Gaza in 2005. There was not a single soldier or settler in Gaza since 2005. Hamas is not trying to liberate anything. They're trying to destroy Israel. And they attempted that on October 7th. They then ran and hid behind their civilians, and they tried and successfully tried to create as much damage in their own population as possible so that people around the West and people around the world would pressure Israel to back down, because that's their MO. Their MO is to do this again and again. They're saying it themselves. If you just listen to Hamas spokespeople, and you don't have to know Arabic, they're saying it in English also. There's plenty of subtitles. For Israel, this is a very bittersweet moment. We have had They say there's about 100 hostages in Gaza right now. We estimate maybe half of them are alive. These are mostly civilians. There are children. There is a baby who we don't even know if he's alive, who was supposed to celebrate his second birthday today. Mothers, elderly people who were kidnapped out of their beds, out of their homes, out of a music festival. And we're trading over 1,200 terrorists, with many of them with blood on their hands or who were arrested while trying to commit terrorist attacks at an exchange rate, I hate to say it, of 30 to 1 or 50 to 1, depending if it's a civilian or a soldier. We have not completely decimated Hamas, and the consensus in Israel is that we will do anything and we will pay this very costly price to get back our civilians who have been suffering with no Red Cross, with no UN, with no humanitarian aid. We don't know where they are. We don't know how they are. The ones who have come back were emaciated, they were abused, they were beaten, they were chained, with zero concern from the international community. And so we're stopping one of the justest wars in history in order to get back whoever is alive of these hostages. But it needs to be clear that this is a very bittersweet moment for the Israeli public, because Hamas says they are not interested in peace. They are interested in another October 7th. And the international community, and especially in the West, does not seem to understand this. And so Hamas must be defeated, if not now, then eventually, because they will do this again and again. They're not interested in peace. They're not interested in a two-state solution. When they say end the occupation, they mean destroy all of Israel.
Well, listen, we understand that the Israeli hostages have now been handed to the Red Cross. If you're watching at home, there were jubilant sort of scenes of people cheering, looking elated by the fact that the hostages have been returned. We've got pictures live from Israel, Tel Aviv, which is what we're watching, and they're clearly watching something. We'll keep you informed on all of that.
3 hostages.
Yeah. So you say it's bittersweet. I hear you. And I see what you're saying. I just don't. I'm almost not really understanding the way a lot of the Westernized nations have behaved in terms of all the pro-Palestine protests. Nobody wants people to be killed or deaths to anyone. But to me, watching it, those protests I felt were somewhat unacceptable in all the chanting. There seemed to be excuses made for people who were chanting things that were ultimately chants for almost genocide. And yet it was blamed on the other side. Dan, how do you feel when you see those protests and hear these people chanting those things? I mean, you mentioned them earlier.
Yeah, we are, I want to say we're absolutely shocked and feel betrayed here in Israel, but the truth is we're kind of used to this from the international community. And we've seen these trend lines over recent years. You know, Hamas invades Israel on October 7th, unprovoked. Hamas invades Israel on October 7th, commits one of the worst, if not the worst, terrorist attacks in history, kidnaps 250 people, murders entire families in their homes with machetes, with machine guns, you name it, with their, burning entire families alive. When Israel goes to get back its hostages and then wages this war while clearing out civilians from areas, they then twist, and this is, a classic psychological warfare. They twist the genocide narrative on Israel, including and very cynically using Holocaust motifs, to say that they are then the victims of a genocide that's not happening. War is a messy thing, and people die. I can't think of any other Western military taking as many pains as Israel has to limit civilian deaths, yet civilians do die. That is the nature of war, and we have to keep reminding the world this is a war we did not ask for, this is a war we didn't want, this is a war that we wish was not pushed on us. And then once, the accusations of genocide, international institutions like the ICC and the ICJ and the UN being used incredibly cynically to charge Israeli leaders for genocide. Your colleague on the news, on the panel, I can't see them, but I could hear you talking about hundreds of thousands. There's no hundreds of thousands dead. It's as I said, it's maybe tens of thousands, and half of them are confirmed combatants. And to wage these accusations of genocide against Israel, and then for what? So they could get back convicted murderers from Israeli jails and then claim a victory and say they're going to do it all over again. Israel is on the front lines of this war against Western civilization, and people are falling for this trap. They're falling for these psychological tricks. And if people don't wake up, I hate to say it, it's going to come to the West after it comes to Israel.
But what would you say to people who would say that Israel's response seemed disproportionate? Because yes, 1,400 people or so were killed, some taken hostage. It's not great. It's awful, actually. But a lot of these people protesting would use the excuse or the banner or the explanation that they are doing it because too many people are dying.
You said it perfectly. It's an excuse, because we see the same people who have been marching, so to speak, for a ceasefire all these years. Now that there is a ceasefire, they're calling for continued revolution, intifada, continuing the fight against Israel. They don't care about Palestinian lives. They never cared about Palestinian lives. Hamas doesn't care about Palestinian lives. Proportionality in the use of conflict is not a proportionality of outcome of how many dead on either side. This is not a sporting match where we want to see an even game between, two football teams or two basketball teams. Proportionality is the concept of, are you using too much force in order to achieve your military aims? And here, Israel, if anything, has restrained itself time and again. Yes, much of Gaza is decimated, and that is only because Hamas literally built 500 kilometers, maybe more, of tunnel infrastructure under every single civilian infrastructure in Gaza: hospitals, schools, homes, mosques, in order to hide the military infrastructure under civilian infrastructure. And so, and yet, before every time Israel went into a location in Gaza, it went to painstaking length to clear civilians out of those areas as much as possible. If not, the actual death toll would have been hundreds of thousands. Israel is a far superior military. It could have extracted much more damage if it would have been abiding by the rules of war that Hamas uses, that Assad in Syria uses, that the Russians in Ukraine use. You would see hundreds of thousands, if not more, Palestinian deaths, and that's not the case.